Hey guys, tonight we're floating back into medieval Scotland, where the weather was bad, the kings were worse, and if you thought your family dinners were awkward, well, just wait. So, get comfy, dim the lights, maybe let the rain noise app do its thing. Because tonight we're talking about one of those stories that sits in that hazy zone between folklore and history. A tale so grim, yet so over the top, that it's almost sleepy in its absurdity. I'm talking about the legend of Sawney Bean and his charming little clan of Scottish cannibals. Now, before you panic, this isn't one of those jump scare horror story podcasts. We're not going to shriek about blood and guts. We're just going to calmly stroll through the details, at the pace of a tired monk copying a manuscript. The Beans were, allegedly, one of the most infamous cannibal families in British folklore. And whether they were real or just an exaggeration invented to make Scotland look extra spooky, well, that's part of the fun. Let's set the scene. We're in medieval Scotland. Picture windswept hills, castles that were damp enough to give you permanent pneumonia, and a whole lot of sheep. Somewhere in this landscape, according to legend, was Alexander Sawney Bean. Now, nobody actually agrees when exactly this story took place. Some say the reign of James VI in the 1600s, others push it way back to the 1200s, which already tells you how solid the evidence is. But let's not stress about dates. We're here for the vibes. So who was Sawney? According to the story, he was basically the medieval version of that one guy in your hometown who insists work is overrated. A lazy man, born into poverty, who had no real skills, no interest in farming, and apparently no charm to barter with. He found himself a wife who was just as motivated or unmotivated as he was. And together they thought, well, normal life clearly isn't for us. Let's do crime. And when they said crime, they didn't mean petty theft or sheep rustling. No, they meant living in a coastal cave and eating anyone unfortunate enough to wander by. Because why not skip straight to cannibalism when you're brainstorming couple goals? Their hideout was supposedly a huge cave near the Ayrshire coast. It stretched deep enough into the cliffs to hide a small village, damp, dark, and smelling like the worst medieval stew imaginable. Perfect for two people who'd soon have a very large family. And when I say large, I mean disturbingly large. The story goes that Sawney and his wife had around 14 kids. And then, since they weren't exactly mingling with the locals, those kids grew up, paired off with each other, and produced dozens more children and grandchildren. Yes, it's about as wholesome as a Habsburg family reunion, except instead of just overbites and weak chins, you've got entire bloodlines raised on human flesh. The number tossed around is 45, as in 45 people crammed into this one coastal cave, forming what can only be described as the least desirable Airbnb in Scottish history. And because 45 mouths don't feed themselves, they developed a system. The Beans would waylay travelers, lone merchants, the occasional wandering noble, or really just anyone unlucky enough to take the wrong path at dusk. They drag them back to the cave, rob them, dismember them, and preserve the flesh like salted pork. Because even cannibals apparently worry about winter food storage. Now, you might be thinking, wouldn't someone notice dozens of missing travelers in the same region? Yes, and they did. For years, bodies kept vanishing. Horses and wagons were found abandoned. Rumors of bandits spread. But apparently no one thought to check the weird cave that always smelled like a butcher's shop in July. And here's the part that's oddly domestic. Supposedly, the Bean family didn't just eat their victims fresh. They also pickled the leftovers, smoked strips of human meat, and even bartered with nearby villagers by selling discarded belongings. So, somewhere in Scotland, people were proudly wearing the latest medieval cloaks, without realizing their last owner had been dinner. Let's just pause for a second, because whether or not this story is true, it really says something about how people imagined the worst kind of family. Not just lazy, not just inbred, but hungry for strangers. Anyway, by this point in the tale, the Beans had terrorized the countryside for decades. And yet, somehow the authorities hadn't caught on. Because of course they hadn't. Since the Middle Ages, these are the same people who thought leeches cured migraines. Efficiency wasn't really their brand. But eventually, someone did escape. One version says a man and his wife were riding home from a fair when they were attacked. The wife, tragically, did not make it, But the husband fought back hard enough to fend off the clan and was rescued by passersby, which was probably awkward because he had to explain, "Yes, a whole family just tried to eat us. And no, I wasn't drunk. That's where we'll float off for now." Next time, we'll drift into how King James himself supposedly got involved in rounding up the Bean clan, and what exactly the medieval justice system thought was a suitable punishment for 45 cave-dwelling cannibals. Spoiler: subtlety was not their strong suit. Alright, so when we left off, the Bean family had been doing their thing. Raising kids, eating strangers, preserving leftovers like the world's least appealing charcuterie board. And it was all working out fine, until someone finally escaped to tell the tale. This is where King James comes in. Depending on which version of the story you believe, it was either James VI of Scotland in the late 1500s or an earlier king centuries before. The details are hazy, which is history's polite way of saying, "We have no clue, but it sounds good in a tavern." Still, the legend says James himself decided this was important enough to handle personally. Because nothing says royal prestige like hunting a family of cave cannibals. So, James supposedly gathered a search party. Not just a few guards, we're talking soldiers, bloodhounds, and maybe half the local nobility who wanted an excuse to wear armor in public. They combed the countryside and eventually, finally, stumbled across the infamous cave. And what they found inside? Well, the chroniclers really leaned into the gruesome details. According to them, the cave was stacked with human remains. Arms, legs, and rib cages hung from the walls like the world's most unsettling medieval pantry. Barrels filled with salted flesh were tucked away in corners. Clothes and jewelry were piled high, trophies from decades of dinner guests. In short, it was less family home and more Hannibal Lecter meets bargain thrift shop. And then there were the Beans themselves. The soldiers captured all 45 of them. Sawney, his wife, their children, and their many grandchildren. A whole community of people who had literally never known life outside of crime, cannibalism, and what must have been some very awkward family mealtimes. Now, you'd think maybe the king would haul them off for a trial. You know, some vague attempt at legal process. But this was medieval justice, which means, why waste time when you can just skip to punishment? So, no trial, no arguments, just straight to execution. The sentence? Let's call it imaginatively brutal. The men of the family were supposedly dismembered alive, hands, feet, and other parts removed one by one, before being left to bleed out. The women and children, meanwhile, were burned alive as spectators looked on. Yes, it's grim, but also very on-brand for a society that thought dunking women in rivers was a solid legal strategy. And that was it. Just like that, the Bean family was erased. According to the story, the Scottish countryside breathed a sigh of relief, and travelers could once again wander about without worrying they'd end up as pickled rations in a seaside cave. Now, here's where the tone shifts a bit, because as sensational as the story is, historians tend to look at it and raise an eyebrow. There's no real contemporary record of Sawney Bean. No official documents. No royal decrees. Nothing in the legal archives. Which is suspicious, because if a king personally oversaw the mass execution of 45 cannibals, you'd think someone would have scribbled it down. Medieval scribes wrote about everything. Even bad weather got recorded. So the total silence is interesting. That's why many people think the story is basically folklore. A sort of exaggerated campfire tale that mixed bits of real crime with a dash of anti-Scottish propaganda. Remember, England and Scotland weren't exactly besties. The English press loved portraying the Scots as barbaric, wild, and possibly cannibalistic. Nothing like a cannibal cave family to prove your point, right? And honestly, it fits the pattern. Cannibalism legends pop up everywhere. From France's mythical Bluebeard to Germany's darker fairy tales. There's always some cautionary figure lurking on the edge of society, reminding you to stay home after dark. Sawney Bean could have been Scotland's entry into that contest. A character who represents laziness, greed, inbreeding, and violence all rolled into one. Basically, the medieval version of a horror movie villain. But whether or not they existed, the Beans took on a life of their own in storytelling. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the tale was being printed in pamphlets, told in taverns, and exaggerated in every possible way. Some versions say the family killed hundreds. Others bump it up to 1,000. Because when you're making up numbers, why not aim high? Even today, the legend clings on. Tour guides in Scotland will still point vaguely toward coastal caves and whisper, "That's where Sawney Bean lived." Never mind that multiple caves claim the honor. It's basically folklore's version of Starbucks, one on every corner. So what do we do with this? On the one hand, the story of Sawney Bean is likely not true. On the other, it tells us something very real about how medieval people imagined their fears. The Beans were the ultimate outsiders. They rejected work, rejected society, lived in the shadows, and quite literally consumed the innocent. They were everything a normal community wasn't, which made them the perfect boogeymen. And maybe that's why this tale has survived for centuries. Not because people believed it, but because people enjoyed it. It's dark, it's grotesque, but it's also oddly organized. A whole family system built on crime. Like a dynasty, but instead of ruling a kingdom, they ruled a pantry full of human jerky. So, as we wrap up tonight's little drift through Scottish legend, maybe keep this in mind. Sometimes the scariest history isn't what actually happened, but what people thought might be happening in the shadows. And whether or not Sawney Bean ever existed, he'll probably keep haunting bedtime stories for a long, long time.